The next item on the agenda is the Regulatory Framework Program 2014-15 Annual Report as outlined in CMD 15 M24 and M24A. And I understand that Mr. Torrey will make the presentation. I'll give you a minute to set up here.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Commission. My name is Brian Torrey, the Director General of the Regulatory Policy Directorate. With me today are Ms. Lynn Forrest, Director of the Regulatory Policy Analysis Division, and Mr. Colin Moses, Director of the Regulatory Framework Division. We are pleased to be here today to present the annual report on the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Program. Although we are regularly before you at meetings to discuss specific regulatory documents, this report provides us with an opportunity to highlight the important work we are doing to engage in broader regulatory initiatives in the federal government and to discuss our forward plans which help ensure that CNSC continues to have a modern, robust, and comprehensive regulatory framework. Our report will provide an overview of the Regulatory Framework Program, its objectives and initiatives, an overview of our activities this past year, starting with a description of CNSC's involvement in the Government of Canada's broad regulatory reform initiatives. We will then describe some of the Regulatory Framework Program key achievements and some of the improvements that we have put in place over the past year, including the soon-to-be-introduced RIAS-like statement to enhance communication of our regulatory objectives, impacts, and purpose during public consultations of our reg docs. We will conclude with a summary of our accomplishments this past year and give a preview of some of the work we'll be doing over the next year. In terms of the program overview, at the highest level, the objectives of the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Program can be summarized as follow. Number one is delivering on commitments in the Government of Canada Regulatory Reform Agenda. Two, developing clear, documented, and accessible regulatory expectations in support of the CNSC's licensing and compliance activities. Three, effective and timely communication with stakeholders. And number four, continuous improvement of the program. All these actions ensure that the CNSC continues to meet its objectives and obligations as a federal regulator and strives to be the best nuclear regulator in the world. The Regulatory Program Directorate is responsible for management of the Regulatory Framework Program. However, we rely heavily on internal and external partners to accomplish these objectives. The Regulatory Framework Steering Committee, made up of Directors General from across the CNSC, is responsible for program oversight and direction. This approach helps us ensure our publications present a consistent whole of CNSC's perspective. In addition, our group regularly reports to CNSC's Executive Committee and Management Committee. As well, we leverage the extensive set of nuclear standards produced by the CSA Group, which provides and supports, or rather supports and provides details on how to meet our regulatory requirements. Finally, we could not meet our objectives of clear requirements without the input of stakeholders, whether through formal public consultations, workshops, or other engagement activities. Over the past year, the valuable input we received from a broad range of stakeholders, including all groups of licensees, environmental non-governmental organizations, international experts, and the Canadian public, have helped ensure our expectations are well understood, pragmatic, and comprehensive. As you know, the CNSC's regulatory framework is governed by the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, which gives us the statutory authority to establish a regulatory framework. The NSCA is supported by legally binding requirements established in regulations. The CNSC's regulations set out high-level expectations. More detailed requirements are included in licenses and certificates, which in turn may reference other regulatory documents or standards. In regulatory documents, the CNSC also provides guidance on how licensees may meet regulatory expectations. Although not legally binding, there is a clear expectation that licensees consider CNSC's guidance in developing their programs. When alternate ways to meet requirements are proposed, licensees must demonstrate how their proposal is equivalent to guidance provided by the CNSC in meeting the regulatory expectations. In terms of how we develop a regulatory document, or the process towards developing a regulatory document, it's consistent with the expectations of the federal government federal government's cabinet directive on regulatory management, the CNSC has implemented a life cycle approach to managing the regulatory framework, including the development of regulations and reg docs. The regulatory document development process has 5 key steps, which are described on this slide and are summarized as follow. The first step is to analyze the issue. A regulatory issue, which the CNSC has decided to address through the development or amendment of a regulation or regulatory document, is first analyzed to determine the appropriate scope and purpose of the project. The analysis includes a review of existing regulations, regulatory documents, and standards, as well as an analysis of the appropriate regulatory actions needed to address the issue. In some cases, discussion papers are used for public consultation during the analysis stage in order to obtain early public input. Increasingly, we are using discussion papers in this manner. This early upfront analysis results in a clear understanding of the regulatory issue or issues at play and their impact, along with the options available to the CNSC to address them. Options could include the development of new regulations, the revision of an existing regulatory document, or the introduction of new regulatory documents. Other regulatory approaches include the use of standards, amending licenses or license condition handbooks, and increasing compliance activities. The next step is to develop a draft document for public consultation. Once a decision has been made to proceed with a new or revised regulatory document, the CNSC develops requirements and guidance for the subject in question. This information may be included as a proposed revision to an existing document or as part of the introduction of a new regulatory document. This stage also includes detailed internal review and approval processes, as well as the final editing, formatting, and translation of the draft documents. The next step is to consult with stakeholders. The consultation process for draft documents has 2 key steps. First, consultation. The draft document is posted on our website. The public, licensees, and interested organizations are invited to comment within a defined period. The next part of that is an invitation to provide feedback on the comments received. All the comments received during the first consultation period are posted on the website. All stakeholders have an opportunity to view these comments and provide additional feedback. As well, increasingly, we use workshops or meetings to provide more in-depth discussion on the key issues. The next step following that consultation is to revise the draft document for approval and publication. The CNSC reviews all comments received during the public consultation stage and determines if any changes are necessary to the document. All the comments are collected in a consultation report, which includes the CNSC's response to each comment. The draft documents are then revised as necessary and prepared for final publication. If the proposed document includes new requirements that the CNSC intends to impose on licensees, the document is presented to the Commission during a public meeting for its review and approval. The final step is to publish the regulatory document. All final documents are released through the CNSC's website for use by stakeholders and licensees, and the implementation begins. Next, the regulatory program activities for fiscal year 2014-15 are consistent with our program objectives over the last several years and continue to focus on several areas of effort, including working with our federal regulatory partners to implement governmental regulatory reform initiatives and continuing to deliver on the commitments as outlined in the CNSC's regulatory framework plan, with a particular focus on a general informal review of the Act and CNSC's regulations, implementing the CNSC's regulatory framework document or framework with the publication of a number of discussion papers and reg docs, and ensuring that our stakeholders are engaged at each stage of the life cycle, either through workshops, meetings, public consultation, or the use of CNSC's website. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Forrest to provide further information on CNSC's regulatory reform activities, including CNSC's forward regulatory plan, and then we'll discuss recent consultation activities through the use of discussion papers to seek early stakeholder input on some of the important regulatory amendments and policy direction.
Thank you, Brian. So the regulatory reform has been a key Government of Canada initiative over the last several years, and CNSC has been and continues to be really actively involved. Released in October 2012, the Red Tape Reduction Action Plan committed to reducing regulatory burden on Canadians and businesses, making it easier to do business with regulators, and improving service and predictability in the federal regulatory system. Specifically, the action plan is aimed at reducing burden on business through a one-for-one rule and by applying a small business lens when developing regulations. In fact, the one-for-one rule has now been put into legislation and enacted into law. Make it easier for business to do business with regulators by introducing interpretation policies, and improve service performance and overall predictability of the regulatory environment through new service standards and forward regulatory plans. In 2014, the federal government published its second scorecard report called the 2013-14 Scorecard Report Implementing the Red Tape Reduction Action Plan, which assesses federal regulators on their implementation of action plan initiatives. Overall, the report confirmed that the CNSC continues to meet its requirements under the action plan. In 2013, the CNSC began posting service standards for high-volume regulatory authorizations. These high-volume authorizations are transactions such as requests for licenses or for certification that number more than 100 per year. The service standards state how quickly an applicant can reasonably expect the CNSC to process their request under normal circumstances. Then in 2014, the CNSC met its commitment to publish both its service standards and its annual performance against those service standards. And in 2015, completed the publication of all its high-volume regulatory authorizations. In 2014 again, the CNSC continued to implement the action plan by posting its interpretation policy as required. The policy describes how the CNSC assists stakeholders to understand regulatory requirements. The CNSC remains committed to providing clear and up-to-date information to help stakeholders understand their regulatory obligations. New for 2014, all federal regulators were required to conduct a baseline count of federal requirements or of administrative requirements in regulations and related forms that impose administrative requirements on businesses. This was an interesting endeavor. Departments and agencies were required to post their administrative burden baseline, which is the name the government gave to the administrative requirements that are laid out by the feds, in 2014, and we will be required to update the count annually. The CNSC met this commitment with the posting of an administrative burden baseline count of 8,169. A significant portion of this count was derived from the forms that the CNSC makes available to help applicants meet information requirements set out in regulations, particularly to help them fill out license applications or report on compliance. These requirements on licensees and license applications, of course, ensure the health, safety, and security of Canadians and the environment. In addition to the red tape initiatives, the CNSC also engaged with the Regulatory Cooperation Council, an initiative between the U.S. and Canada with a goal to further enhance areas of cooperation between regulatory bodies. The CNSC already works closely with regulatory bodies in the U.S. in areas of transportation, certification, and CNSC staff is now exploring additional areas, potential areas for cooperation with our U.S. counterparts to support the initiative. Continuing with regulatory reform, another element has been continued collaborative engagement between federal regulators. In 2014-15, CNSC continued to collaborate with the Major Projects Management Office and the Northern Projects Management Office on overarching project management and accountability for major resource projects in the federal regulatory review process. A key initiative this year was CNSC staff outreach in the North in collaboration with the with the Northern Project Management Office by delivering information sessions, CNSC 101 information sessions, in fact, on the role of the Canadian nuclear regulator to potential communities affected by the proposed Kegavik mining project. Moving forward, the CNSC will continue to support the project management offices. Now we move closer to home into the area of the CNSC's regulations. An important element of our regulatory framework program includes the regular review and development of the regulations. Like all regulatory documents, the regulations under the NSC are scheduled for these regular reviews. And at the conclusion of each review, CNSC staff determine whether amendments to regs are needed at that time or whether the current set of requirements are effective in ensuring the continued safety of regulated facilities and activities. Over the course of the past year, staff managed a number of these regulatory review projects. The first was the publication of the amendments to the nuclear security regulations and the nuclear substances and radiation devices regulations to address outstanding issues raised by the Standing Joint Committee on the Scrutiny of Regulations, who are charged by Parliament to identify opportunities to clarify regulations. These were just minor, they're called miscellaneous amendments. In addition, CNSC staff progressed on their work to amend the packaging and transport of nuclear substances regulations to introduce ambulatory reference to the latest edition of the IAEA regulations and to address operational issues that have arisen since the packaging and transport of nuclear substances regulations came into force. The regulations were presented to the Commission in March and were approved by Treasury Board in June and will be published in July. Yeah. Consistent with our efforts to continue modernizing our regulations, based on lessons learned from Fukushima, CNSC staff are also proposing amendments to the radiation protection regulations, the Class 1 facilities regulations, and the uranium mines and mills regulations altogether to enhance the safety of nuclear facilities and the protection of workers as recommended by the Fukushima Task Force. This review is nearing completion, and CNSC staff is working with the Department of Justice to revise the regulations in advance of stakeholder consultation later in 2015. Brian spoke earlier about discussion papers. Stakeholder feedback is key to the success of the CNSC's regulatory framework program, and discussion papers play an important role in the selection and development of CNSC's requirements and guidance. They're used to solicit early public feedback on CNSC proposed policies or approaches, and they underline the CNSC's commitment to a transparent consultation process. So during 2014-15, we published 3 discussion papers for public consultation. First, the one on design extension conditions, quite a technical document, which summarizes the CNSC's views on design extension conditions with the intent of establishing a dialogue with stakeholders and arriving at a common understanding of the associated terminology and application of the concepts of DAECs, based largely on CNSC's Reg Doc 2.5.2, Design of Reactor Facilities, Nuclear Power Plants, which was published in May 2014. This particular paper was not aimed at an ultimate regulatory document by any means. It was unique in that it was designed to commence a dialogue, and it did that. The next one, regulatory modernization, invited stakeholder input on the effectiveness of CNSC's regulations as a whole. Consultation closed on May 29, and the feedback that we have received will prove valuable as we analyze all of the regulations together with a view to what they might look like in 2025 and beyond. Finally, there was the discussion paper on the proposed amendments to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Import and Export Control Regulations. The proposed amendments address some technical and administrative issues relating to the regulations and reflect changes to the nuclear suppliers group lists, thereby ensuring continued effective regulation of the nuclear exporting and importing industry. The control list is established by participating governments of the nuclear suppliers group, including Canada. The control lists are published in the International Atomic Energy Agency information circulars and incorporated into domestic nuclear non-proliferation policy and regulations in the NSG countries. In Canada, these control lists are incorporated into the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's Nuclear Non-Proliferation Import-Export Control Regulations, and also into the Export Control List administered by the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Development. You can see that consultation on that will close in July 2015. I'll now turn the presentation to Colin Moses to describe our work on the CNSC's own regulatory framework.
Thank you, Ms. Forrest. As you will recall, with the launch of the CNSC's efforts to modernize and clarify our regulatory requirements in 2008, we developed an extensive plan to review all existing regulatory documents and to document our expectations, in a number of different areas. This work, while useful in prioritizing our efforts, had us on track to develop a regulatory document library of over 150 documents. Recognizing the risks of duplication, overlap, and stakeholder confusion with this approach, CNSC staff developed a more coherent structure to the CNSC's Library of Regulatory Documents and presented that to the Commission in 2013. All regulatory documents published by the CNSC are now aligned with the document framework shown here. The documents are organized into 3 broad categories. The first, outlining expectations specific to different regulated facilities and activities, generally in the form of guidance on applying for a license. The second, providing requirements and guidance in specific technical areas according to the Safety and Control Area Framework. And the third, covering all remaining areas that warrant clarity throughout our regulatory framework. In the past year, CNSC staff have been making progress on implementing this vision. As you can see on this slide, with details provided in our regulatory framework plan, we are working towards completing initial versions of the full suite of RegDocs by 2018. To date, a total of 16 RegDocs have been published since the new CNSC regulatory framework structure was adopted in 2013. Another 9 will be completed this fiscal year, as well as 3 updates to other existing RegDocs. One of the key initiatives over the past few years was CNSC's commitment to update several RegDocs in the CNSC's regulatory framework to reflect lessons learned from the Fukushima nuclear event of March 2011 and addressing findings from the CNSC's Fukushima Task Force report. In total, 7 RegDocs have been completed or revised to support this commitment. At the same time, CNSC staff have reviewed its regulations to identify opportunities for improvement. I will outline some of this work on the following slides. Firstly, leveraging experience gained in developing RegDoc 232 severe accident management programs for nuclear reactors, developed as part of the CNSC's Fukushima Omnibus Regulatory Document Project in 2013, the CNSC published RegDoc 232 Accident Management, which lays out our expectations for accident management measures for nuclear reactors. This RegDoc was published in October 2014. Further, to feedback from licensees received during the Commission meeting and subsequent Commission direction, CNSC staff have been in discussions with affected licensees to discuss and clarify expectations for the implementation of this document. RegDoc 241, Deterministic Safety Analysis, sets out requirements and guidance for the preparation and presentation of a safety analysis that demonstrates the safety of a nuclear facility. This document updated RD and GD 310 to ensure consideration is given to some of the issues faced during Fukushima, including consideration of site-wide issues and cliff edge effects, as well as confirmation of the availability of water and power during significant low-frequency events. RegDoc 242, Probabilistic Safety Assessment for nuclear power plants, sets out the requirements for a PSA, updated. This document updated S294 to introduce expectations for consideration of spent fuel pools, multi-unit effects, and to clarify PSA objectives. Both RegDoc 241 and RegDoc 242 were managed as part of the regulatory Fukushima Omnibus Regulatory Document Project. Continuing with Fukushima and addressing lessons learned, Reg Doc 252, Design of Reactor Facilities, Nuclear Power Plants, was published in May 2014, setting requirements and guidance for new license applications for new designs of water-cooled nuclear power plants. In addition to introducing new regulatory guidance related to the regulatory requirements, this document introduced changes related to lessons from Fukushima, as well as the results of CNSC staff's benchmarking of other nuclear regulators' design requirements. Finally, in October 2014, the CNSC published Reg Doc 210-1, Nuclear Emergency Preparedness and Response, setting out the emergency preparedness requirements and guidance related to the development of emergency measures for licensees and license applicants of Class 1 nuclear facilities and uranium mines and mills. In addition to the Fukushima-related work, the CNSC continued to modernize its framework in a number of other areas. In August 2014, Reg Doc 222 Personnel Training was published. This document sets out requirements and guidance for the analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation, documentation, and management of training at nuclear facilities within Canada. Reg Doc 223 Personnel Certification Radiation Safety Officers was published in July 2014 and sets out guidance to assist applicants in completing an application for certification as a radiation safety officer pursuant to the Class 2 nuclear facilities and prescribed equipment regulations. Finally, in May 2014, Reg Doc 311, Reporting Requirements for Nuclear Power Plants, was published and sets out the timing and information that nuclear power plant licensees are required to report to the CNSC. Reg Doc 311 supersedes S99, Reporting Requirements for Operating Nuclear Power Plants, which was published in March of 2003. Our work will continue in fiscal year 2015-16, with CNSC staff working on all sections of the regulatory framework, including tracking potential improvements to the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, continuing work to modernize our regulations, and continuing to develop Reg Docs. Our focus on stakeholder engagement continues, with up to 7 discussion papers and 15 Reg Docs expected to be released for stakeholder input. We'll also remain flexible in our consultation approaches, leveraging the input received from stakeholders to build a comprehensive and robust regulatory framework. All our planned activities are outlined in the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Plan, which is published on the CNSC's website and included in your material today. On the following slides, I'll highlight some of the over 50 active projects that we have underway this year. With up to 7 discussion papers planned this fiscal year, the CNSC will continue to implement its commitment to our stakeholders for early engagement on our regulatory initiatives. This includes a discussion paper exploring the regulatory framework for waste and decommissioning, discussing options for the ideal framework to oversee the diverse approaches to waste management and decommissioning. In addition, the CNSC will be seeking input as to the optimal approach to setting expectations for the integration of strategies, policies, and practices that consider a broad range of human factors to support excellence in human performance. Building on the CNSC's policy on cost-benefit, the CNSC will be seeking input on the necessary elements of a robust cost-benefit analysis and clarifying how the CNSC considers this information in assessing proposals from the regulated community. Looking forward to the future, consistent with our commitment to be ready and responsive to whatever it will bring, the CNSC has been monitoring technological developments and will be publishing a discussion paper seeking input on some of the new and unique policy considerations associated with regulation of small modular reactors. Turning now to regulations, the CNSC will be moving forward with targeted amendments to our regulations to address lessons from Fukushima, as discussed earlier in this presentation. In addition, the radiation protection regulations are undergoing a broader review in the interest of ensuring continued alignment with the evolving international standards and implementing any improvements that have been identified since the regulations were introduced. Finally, as was discussed earlier in the slide, CNSC staff will advance with amendments to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation, Import, and Export Control regulations. Regarding Reg Docs, the CNSC will be clarifying regulatory guidance for nuclear substance and radiation devices licensees. In addition, building on the standard developed by the CSA with the CNSC support, we will be outlining guidance for the certification of exposure device operators. In the area of human performance management, further to an initial public consultation and subsequent stakeholder meeting, the CNSC will be issuing a revised document on managing worker fatigue for public input ahead of the planned publication later this year. At the same time, we continue to progress on a broader document addressing all the elements of fitness for duty. Moving on to operating performance, CNSC staff recently held a constructive stakeholder meeting to help inform the final draft of Reg Doc 231, which outlines regulatory requirements and guidance for the oversight of construction and commissioning activities to ensure the reactor facility is capable of operating safely and reliably over its lifetime. It is expected that the Reg Doc will be brought forward to the Commission later this year for consideration. In addition, following extensive consultations with stakeholders, we are pleased to note that Reg Doc 233 Periodic Safety Reviews was published in April 2015 following the Commission's approval. The document sets out the CNSC's requirements and guidance with regard to a PSR of a nuclear power plant, which is a comprehensive evaluation of the design, condition, and operation of nuclear power plants, providing an overall view of plant safety and the quality of safety documentation. Finally, Reg Doc 252 Design of Reactor Facilities, Nuclear Power Plants, is currently being reviewed to determine if additional information is needed on electrical systems. Continuing on the topic of design, the CNSC is currently drafting requirements and guidance for the design of fixed radiography installations and will be shortly launching a public consultation. In the Safeguards and Non-Proliferation series, Reg Doc 213.2 provides guidance for licensees who intend to import and export nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items, which are also known as controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information. This document is due to be published this fiscal year. With a continued focus on the transparency of our regulatory processes, the CNSC recently published Reg Doc 351, Licensing Process for Class 1 Nuclear Facilities and Uranium Mines and Mills, which provides an overview of the licensing process for Class 1 nuclear facilities and uranium mines and mills. Similarly, updates to the recently published Reg Doc 352 Compliance and Enforcement Administrative Monetary Penalties ensure our processes for compliance actions are transparent to stakeholders. To complete this picture, CNSC staff are currently working on Reg Doc 353 Regulatory Fundamentals, which provides information on the CNSC's regulatory approach and its philosophy to achieve its regulatory objectives. And finally, further to an action from the Commission, the CNSC has advanced on the development of a glossary of CNSC terminology, which lists the terms and definitions used in the Nuclear Safety Control Act, its regulations made under the Act, as well as CNSC regulatory documents and other CNSC publications. As an aside, we are not the only ones seized with this, with both the Canadian Standards Association and the IAEA working to update and streamline their glossaries, a critical element to ensuring expectations and guidance are well understood. Aside from Reg Docs, we continue our active participation in other standards development activities. In particular, consensus standards produced by the CSA are an important component of the CNSC's regulatory framework plan. In fiscal year 2014-15, the CNSC and CSA continue their efforts to ensure alignment between the CSA Nuclear Standards Program and the CNSC Regulatory Framework Program. CNSC and CSA committees and working groups meet regularly to discuss program planning, communication of activities, and CSA nuclear program work against the CNSC's Regulatory Framework Plan. We continue to focus on the transparency of this work. Due to contributions from the CNSC, CSA standards are available to view through the CSA Communities of Interest website for all stakeholders. In addition, the CNSC issues notification of draft standards that are issued for public review by the CSA. These are circulated to the CNSC's over 2,500 stakeholders through our distribution list. Over the years, CNSC has made several enhancements to our analysis of regulatory issues, including initiating early engagement with stakeholders to help identify concerns or challenges with regulatory requirements, and increasing the use of discussion papers and workshops to receive this feedback. Recently, stakeholders suggested that the CNSC adopt the use of a regulatory impact analysis statement for RegDocs, similar to that which is used in federal regulation making. Recognizing the effectiveness of this assessment during regulation making, CNSC staff are developing a similar document for publication with draft RegDocs when seeking stakeholder feedback. The RIAS-like statement will provide additional information on the regulatory objectives of the creation or amendment of a RegDoc, the approach being taken to meet that objective, an overview of the expected impacts on licensees and applicants, and information on the proposed implementation plan. It is expected that the RIAS-like statement will provide stakeholders with a better understanding of the document objective, regulatory approach, and expected impacts, and encourage stakeholders to provide CNSC staff with feedback, submitting information on potential cost impacts, and providing calculations and assumptions used to derive those impacts. The RIAS-like statement will be piloted in this fiscal year. Finally, as evidenced throughout this presentation, stakeholder engagement is a clear priority. Through the many ways outlined on this slide, we seek to ensure the transparency of our activities, depending on the constructive feedback we receive on our regulatory initiatives, to ensure the regulatory requirements that we set are reasonable and effective at achieving the desired regulatory outcome. I will now turn the presentation back to Mr. Tory to conclude.
Thank you. So in summary, the past year was a very busy year, and the workload's going to continue over the next few years in terms of implementing the regulatory framework. The CNSC remains connected and in line with government regulatory improvement initiatives as well, and has implemented a number of improvements with a particular focus on actively seeking opportunities to engage and consult with all interested parties. We have continued to modernize the framework through the development of the new regulatory documents and regulatory amendments to ensure the CNSC's framework continues to reflect the latest developments in domestic and international lessons learned and guidance. The CNSC's regulatory framework plan outlines this year's activities and looks forward over the next year to develop and maintain a long-term plan for our regulatory framework. This work plan will remain flexible and adaptable to the latest developments in the federal and nuclear regulation. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the hard work of CNSC staff involved who have worked diligently in moving this plan forward. This completes our presentation. If there are any questions, we're available to answer them. Thank you.